It is a decision by Meta that makes billions of dollars of profit all around the world, that they have no accountability to journalists that actually tell local stories.
Facebook has no obligation to do that. Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. It's been almost a year since Bill C-18 came into full force. The intent of the bill was to force Meta, Facebook's parent company, and Google to quote-unquote pay their fair share for links shared on their platform that directed to Canadian news content. Rather than be extorted into paying an uncapped amount for linking to Canadian news content, Meta called the Liberal government's bluff and started blocking all news links on Facebook. But how has that turned out for them and the Canadian media?
Let's take a look.
Facebook turned off the news in Canada. What happened next? A law intended to help small publishers is harming them. As owner, editor, and sole reporter of Gugu Quest News, Maureen Gugu starts the day by publishing her latest scoops about Canada's Indigenous communities. Tracking the number of people that flock to read those stories used to be a pleasure. Nowadays, Ms. Gugu says she dreads it. Until last summer, her website got about 12,000 monthly visits. Now it gets perhaps a quarter of that. This is not what Canada's government envisioned when it passed the Online News Act last June. The law promised fairness in the Canadian digital news marketplace. The idea, inspired by a similar law in Australia, was to force Google and Meta, the kings of search and social media, to pay news outlets when their articles appear in search results and social feeds. Publishers and broadcasters have long complained that the tech firms have gobbled up their advertising market. The act was meant to claw some of that money back.
In November, Google agreed to pay 100 million Canadian dollars a year into a government-run fund for Canadian newsrooms. But Meta declined. News makes up less than 3% of the Facebook feed globally, the firm said, and is of little value to it. Publishers benefit when their stories are shared, it added, which is why most post their own content themselves. Instead of paying, Meta said it would block news links from its apps. Since August, users of Facebook and Instagram in Canada have been unable to view or share links to any news site from Google Quest News to Economist.com. 9 months later, the number of people using Facebook and Instagram in Canada hasn't budged. The apps are being downloaded as much as ever, according to Sensor Tower, a marketing intelligence firm. Nor does the lack of news seem to be hurting Meta's pocket, despite an ad boycott led by Canada's government. The firm does not break out Canadian earnings, but its ad revenue across the United States and Canada has grown 19% in the 9 months since the news blackout began, compared with the same period in the previous year.
For news organizations, the impact has been more dramatic. A study published in April by researchers at McGill University and the University of Toronto found that 6 months after the blackout, the Facebook pages of Canadian national news outlets had lost 64% of their engagement, likes, comments, and so on, while those of local outlets had lost 85%. Almost half of local titles had stopped posting on Facebook at all, quote, gutting the visibility of local news content, end quote, the researchers found. Large publications with their own apps and widely known brands are well placed to weather the ban. But for some digital-only titles, Meta's blackout has been, quote, absolutely devastating, end quote, says Paul Deegan, head of News Media Canada, which represents publishers. Adam Rayburn, editor of Energetic City, a site covering what he says is otherwise a quote-unquote news desert in rural British Columbia, says the news ban initially cut his readership by 30 to 40%. Quote, I don't understand why Google, Instagram, and Facebook need to pay us when we use their platforms to share our articles, end quote, he wrote in his final Facebook post in August.
Readers are finding ways around the ban. Unable to share links, some are posting screenshots of articles. On quote-unquote only in Canada, a Facebook group with 500,000 members, jokes and memes are interspersed with photos of headlines from blocked news sites from the BBC to CTV, a Canadian television network. The sharing of news screenshots on Facebook has more than tripled since the blackout, largely replacing links as a source of engagement on political Facebook pages, the McGill and Toronto researchers found. News outlets are adapting too. Energetic City has signed up 5,000 readers to an email newsletter, built a mobile app, and put up posters around town with QR codes leading to its website. Quote, "We basically have to reteach our readers how to find the news," end quote, Mr. Rayburn says. Google Quest is courting audiences outside Canada. Indigenous communities in the United States who can still share news on Facebook are a growing share of the readership. Ms. Gugu is planning a reporting trip to Maine.
Some worry that dubious sources of information will fill the gap left by the mainstream sort. Quote, "With the ban on news, there has been an explosion of disinformation and misinformation," end quote, says Pascal Saint-Onge, the minister responsible for the act. NewsGuard, a fact-checking organization, found that quote-unquote unreliable sources accounted for 6.9% of engagement with news on Facebook in Canada in the 90 days after the blackout, compared with 2.2% in the 90 days before. The McGill and Toronto researchers, by contrast, found no increase in misinformation. On social media, quote, "The clean drinking water and the sewage are going through the same pipe," end quote, says Mr. Deegan. Quote, "Without news, the only thing going through is the sewage," end quote. He fears this lowers incentives for politicians to engage with journalists, prompting them to communicate directly through social media instead. Quote, "Without that level of scrutiny, that is bad for democracy," end quote, he says. An election is due next year. Canada's communications regulator will decide later this year whether the fact that Meta has blocked news links excuses it from making payments. Ms. Saint-Onge says that Meta should still have to pay because news content is still finding its way onto its platforms. If the regulator disagrees, then, quote, "We'll see how it's possible to amend that piece of legislation because as long as we're in government, we're not going to give up," end quote, she says. Any amendments would have to respect Meta's freedom of expression and make sure that, quote, "We don't infringe on that by obliging certain content to be shown," end quote, she acknowledges. News Media Canada, which supports the new law, is attacking Meta on another front, lodging a complaint with Canada's competition regulator, arguing that Meta's link blocking is an abuse of its dominant position.
Canada's difficulties may cause countries mulling similar laws to think carefully. When Australia wrung a reported $200 million per year out of Google, and Meta using its news media bargaining code passed in 2021, countries including Britain, Brazil, and South Africa pricked up their ears. But Meta appears emboldened by its Canadian experience. In February, it said it would not renew the deals it had earlier struck in Australia. Quote, "For now, Meta has left the building," end quote, Jesper Dube, who was head of international news partnerships at Meta until last year, told a journalism conference in Italy in April. Quote, "If you want to measure the value of news, take it away and see what happens." And they did in Canada. Nothing happened, end quote. In future, whenever Meta faces demands for payment, quote, "they will just walk away," end quote, Mr. Dube said. That will mean less news on the world's biggest social media network, and fewer readers for small publishers. Ms. Gugu hopes Meta's news blackout will one day lift, and in the meantime has applied for money from the Google Fund. For now, however, the main effect of the new law is that fewer people are reading her stories. Quote, "The act is supposed to help us," end quote, she says. Quote, "But it's hurting us," end quote.
So, I believe we called this back in the spring or the summer when we were talking about Bill C-18, and we said, this is going to hurt news media more than it helps it because it's no skin off Meta's teeth to just block the news links. But mainstream media as well as smaller outlets are relying on being able to share their stories on platforms like Facebook, then have people click those links, go to their websites for the stories, and then be presented with advertising on their own websites. And that's where they get their revenue from. So now they're missing that.
Well, and the funny thing is all you hear from Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau is greedy CEOs, greedy CEOs. Well, here's the thing. The greedy CEOs aren't in the grocery stores. They're probably greedy CEOs, but they're not the ones that are really impacting grocery prices. The real greedy CEOs here are the ones that are actually in the news organizations. Why? Because you would think that the smaller the news outlet, the more that they would need Facebook for traffic. And you've heard in this article that the smaller news outlets don't seem to think that Facebook and Google need to pay them. Why? Because they're using their platform to actually get engagement. So it's not that Facebook and Google are using the news. You've seen the stats. News accounts for maybe 3 to 4% of the revenue, less than they would spend on paper, and Facebook hardly has any paper. So you actually have these news organizations that have been using Facebook and Google for free. They haven't been paying them. You would argue that they should, because Google and Facebook count as a distributing platform for their news. So, it comes back to the example. It's like if you write a book and then you want to distribute it through Canada Post, and then you call up Canada Post and you tell Canada Post that, hey, you're paying me for you to distribute my book. Canada Post is going to say, what? Get out of here. But this is what is being peddled here. And why? Oh, because the news organizations are angry that they didn't adapt to the times, and Facebook and Google took their advertising revenue. And because these news organizations have not adapted and have not been innovative in how to reach new markets, they've relied on government funding as a crutch. And because of that crutch, they became complacent. And so what did they do? Well, they rang up their buddy Justin Trudeau and they said, we need money from Google and Facebook because we're too lazy and we're too dumb to actually fix this problem ourselves and actually run a business, which is what we're supposed to do. How many businesses have closed in Canada because they just ran out of money? They didn't get Justin Trudeau running to their door and saying, here's some free money for you.
Well, my mom's business was one of them.
Right. So this is what's going on. And again, Trudeau is still peddling this stuff. This was a video that we ran a week ago, but here's a segment of it.
Wildfire season has already begun in BC, but news is still banned on Facebook and Instagram. You said yourself this is likely going to be a bad season. We interviewed law professor Michael Geist last week, and he told us that in his view, Meta would unblock news in Canada if the Online News Act were changed. Would your government compromise with Meta so that Canadians could once again post news on Facebook?
Meta, Facebook, has made the decision that they shouldn't have to compensate hardworking journalists telling local news stories. It is a decision by Meta that makes billions of dollars of profit all around the world, that they have no accountability to journalists that actually tell local stories, work hard to actually make sure people are properly informed, and instead make money off of sharing of information without recognizing the role they must play in a strong, independent media that is enhancing our democracies.
Facebook has no obligation to do that.
Right. It would be like saying, oh, I don't know, McDonald's has to pay for news shared between customers. Like, it's the most ridiculous thing.
Well, and again, you're saying, oh, well, they're making money off this stuff. Hello, they're a business. How about again, the news organizations have paid Facebook literally nothing to use their platform to post their stories for exposure. How about that?
Right, because the news platforms were making money off Meta because people would see a link on Facebook, they would click it, and then they would go to that news article on the website where there would be advertising, or maybe it would be behind a paywall and people would have to sign up. So news outlets were making money by posting links on Facebook. They just got greedy.
Well, and the funny thing is we're seeing it. We're seeing the literal symbiotic relationship that is broken here. Because, yeah, Facebook is making, maybe 3% less revenue as a result of this. But who's the real loser here? It's not Facebook. It's the news organizations that are denied that traffic, up to 30 to 40% of their traffic. It's bizarre. But all you hear Trudeau saying these days is pay their fair share. And he almost even slipped up there. He said, well, Facebook makes billions. He was almost going to say, they should be sharing that billions with the little people.
Socialist mentality right there.
Right.
And you know what else I found absolutely horrifying in this article? I'll read this excerpt. It says, Ms. St. Ange says that Meta should still have to pay because news content is finding its way onto its platforms. If the regulator disagrees, then, quote, we'll see how it's possible to amend that piece of legislation because as long as we're in government, we're not going to give up. That's basically saying if we don't get our way, we're going to change the laws to make sure we get our way. That's horrifying.
Right? And Justin Trudeau is trying to warn you about Pierre Poilievre. He's saying, watch out what he's going to do in the laws. Well, we say, look at what Trudeau has already done with the law and what he has yet to do with the law. Think about that when you're going to be voting in the next election.